Hello everyone! Over the last month I've been working on a universal transition shader, which you can actually start using right now. Now, the reason for which I created this shader is because whenever I wanted to add a transition to my game, what I would do would be to just go to Godot shaders and try to find some transition. And yeah, sometimes you strike gold, but other times you find a transition that sort of looks like what you envisioned, and you have to take the shader, you have to understand it, you have to modify it so that you can get to the effect you want. Now, what I wanted was a solution that allowed me to get to the effect I want without having to search for a bunch of transitions. I wanted to just adjust some parameters and get the transition that I want. Okay, but let us actually see what this shader is capable of and how to use it. So I have attached in a GitHub repository a demo project in which I have this shader. Now you could clone this repository to get the demo project, or you could of course simply copy directly the shader and put it directly in your project. In either way, you are going to reach a situation that looks something like this. You are going to have a sprite or some canvas item with which you want to reveal what's behind it. So if you want to apply this shader to it, you are going to go to material and create a new shader material. And on this, I'm simply going to drag the shader. Okay, now you see that under this shader, I have a bunch of sub properties. Now I'm going to go over each and every one of them, not in too much detail because everything is already documented in the repository, but I just want to show you what the shader is capable of and how I usually use it when I use it. So the first thing that I care about is this animation tab, which basically allows me to advance the animation. So you see now the progress is 0, but if I increase this progress, now I have the default animation happening, which is just a rectangle coming from the top left corner. Okay, but how could I configure this animation? Well, first of all, I have a tab called Shader Parameters. Now under these, you are going to find general shader settings. So for example, you see that my Godot icon here has some transparent corners. Maybe if I want to not see this transparency, I could simply uncheck use sprite alpha, and as you can see, I no longer have any transparency in this corner. However, I like the transparency and I'm gonna move on to the next parameters, which actually come in a pair because use transition texture and transition texture work together in order to transition to a different texture instead of transitioning just to a transparent texture, so like to nothing. So if I wanted to transition, let's say from this day to this night image, what I could do would be to first of all change the texture to day, and then I could maybe zoom out and then I could put this night texture here and I could check use transition texture. And now if I advance the progress, you see that I'm transitioning between day and night. Okay, but let's just undo those things and let's get back here to see what other parameter I have. This is one important parameter, which is the transition type. Well, of course, it wouldn't be too interesting if I only had like rectangular transitions. I also have the possibility to use a mask, which is just using whatever image you want to create the transition, to use a shape, which is a geometric shape, and to use a clock. But we are going to go over all of these soon. Now, you will see that below, for each of these transition types, I have properties only related to them. So for example, if I have now selected the basic transition type, if I'm going to modify anything in the clock transition controls, you'll see that nothing is going to happen. So whenever you want to change something regarding your transition, you need to pay attention to what transition type you're working with. So for the transition type, I have the basic transition controls, which only contain a feather for now. So as you can see, I can increase this in order to make this rectangle be feathered. Okay, but on top of this, I also have some generic settings that you can apply to all kinds of transitions because these are positioning related settings. First of all, if I wanted, I could invert this transition, so I could just click on invert, and as you can see, now the part that was black is turned back to Godot and vice versa. I also have this from center option, which allows the transition to happen from the center of the rectangle. And as you can see, it starts and animates from the center. Now, another thing is the grid size, which is highly flexible because it allows for a bunch of configurations, and we are going to see some of these configurations when I'm going to show you some recipes that you can follow in order to make interesting animations. Now, what this grid does is to basically create more elements that are going to help create this transition effect. So for example, now I only have here one square, but what I could do would be to have a grid of 2 by 2, which gives me 4 squares with which I can animate just as before. Now, what's interesting is that I can also use negative numbers to change the positioning of my squares. So let's just uncheck from center, and you can see that they all start from the top left corner. But if I want, I could put y to be -2, and you see that now they start from the bottom left corner. If I make this -2 as well, it's the rightmost corner, and if I make this 2, now it's the top right corner. So yeah, you can see that it gives you some freedom, and also like nobody really tells me to make an integer number here. I could do 2.5 to make this thing. Now, if this thing helps you, then of course you can use it to achieve whatever transition you want. Okay, but let's get back to maybe a 4 by 4 and let's center it again, because I want to show you the stagger. Now, with the stagger, I can basically offset rows or columns of my element here. So if I wanted, I could slightly increase this, and as you can see, I can move these rows. And what's interesting is that when we are going to actually animate this, we are not forced to only animate the progress. We could animate the progress and the stagger as well. So we could make this move while the progress is increasing to create some interesting effect. And you are going to see that by combining all these effects, we are going to get more and more interesting results. And yeah, we can just try a bunch of things out. Okay, but with the stagger on the x-axis, I'm going to be able to move the rows, and with the stagger on the y-axis, I'm going to be able to move the columns. And if I start moving both, well, freaky things are going to happen, but maybe these things are something that we'd like. So for example, if I make both 1, 1, you see that I get this interesting pattern with which I create the transition. Okay, but moving back to the original stagger, you'll see that now I can also change the stagger frequency, which is telling me how often I'm going to apply this stagger. So instead of applying it every 2 rows as I'm doing now, what I could do is to simply say 1, and now I'm applying it for all the rows. Now, another thing that I could do would be to set it to 3, and you see that I apply it only to the first and to the second row, and of course this applies as well for the vertical axis. Now, the flip frequency option is an option which flips a row or a column, but now it's not very visible because these are very symmetrical, but maybe I could increase this rotation angle, over which I skipped by mistake, but this rotation angle, yeah, obviously just rotates whatever shape I have here. And I could rotate it by 20 degrees, and now if I put a flip frequency of 2, you'll see that every other row is flipped instead of being in the same position as it was before. Okay, now let's reset everything and let's also take a look at the mask transition controls. So here I have a mask texture which I can apply, and I have this mask star, and you see that nothing happened. Nothing happened because I haven't changed my transition type. And if I change the transition type to mask, you see that now I have a star here in the center, which of course I can rotate, I can do whatever I want with it, and I can use it to progress this animation. Now, if I wanted to, this is a bit experimental, but if I wanted to use a different scaling for this, I could be like 2 by 1, and you see now my star is a bit squished, and it stays squished like this no matter how I resize this element. Okay, now moving on, I'm going to go to shape transition controls, and again, in order to see the shapes, I'm going to have to change the transition type to shape, and in here you see that, yeah, what can I have? It's a regular shape, a polygon, which has 6 edges, and if I press on this arrow, I'm going to get a polygon with 5, and a square and a triangle, and I could use these, I could even feather them to create some interesting effects. And now moving on, the last thing is the clock transition type, which to no surprise, it creates a transition that looks like a clock. So for example, if I increase or decrease the progress, you see that I have this kind of clock wipe. Now I could also increase the sectors of this clock to make it look slightly more interesting. And I could also set the clock feather to give this smooth effect. Now, one interesting thing you can do with the clock is to create interesting patterns by making it into a bigger grid. So for example, I could turn this into a 4x4 grid and also increase the number of sectors to 4. And after I increase this, you see I have this interesting pattern. But what I could also do is to make this pattern be seamless. So for example, I could set the flip frequency on the X and on the Y axis to 2. And now if I increase and decrease the progress, you see that I have this interesting pattern. And if I also increase the feather, well, it makes for some very freaky visuals. But yeah, you might want to use any of these. Okay, now for the last thing, I have here this progress bias property, which is very interesting. And I'm just going to show you how by resetting everything here. And let's go back to a basic type of animation, which is a grid of 4x4. And okay, maybe what if I didn't want to make all of these appear at the same time? Well, I could set a bias so that some things towards the left appear earlier than some things towards the right. So what I could do would be to set the bias of 2, for example. And as you can see, they no longer appear at the same time. And if I wanted to make this effect even more clear, what I could do is to set the bias to 10, let's say, and you see that I can increase the progress and the effect is even more obvious. Now, of course, I can make this bias on the y-axis as well, and you see that I create this interesting effect. Now, with that being said, you'll see that in the repository, I have added a bunch of recipes that you can follow in order to achieve the most common effects. And I will keep adding to those recipes. And maybe if you find some interesting recipe, you could even suggest it in the repository so that everyone has more interesting effects by default. Alright, but as a final thing, let us actually see how we would make these things happen while in-game, because as nice as it is to fiddle around with the parameters in the editor, this has no effect if we are running our game. We actually need to create an animation. Now, the best way of creating an animation for this case, in my opinion, is by using an animation player. And to this animation player, all I have to do is to create a new animation, to call it maybe transition. And if I click on transition, you will see here that I now have these keyframes and I could click on progress, for example, and click create. And I could move to second number 1, right here, 1, and click again on the keyframe. And you see that the animation is happening. And if I now click on play, I will have this animation happen. And I could even set this animation to happen at startup. I could save the scene and I could press F6. And as you can see, the animation is happening while in game. Okay, but from this point, our options are basically limitless because we can animate any property here. So for example, if I wanted to set this to be from center and animate the rotation angle for some reason, I could set another keyframe for the rotation angle. And when this reaches 1, I could set the rotation angle to 45 degrees to make this interesting shape here. And of course, I now have to make another keyframe, and maybe I have to change the progress here to be larger so that the whole image is being covered. Now, if I press, you see that I make this rotating animation. And I think that's really neat, and that's very, very interesting. And I honestly am so excited to see what kind of animations you come up with, and I really hope that you are going to find this useful. Okay, but I've been talking for quite some time, so that's pretty much it. Thanks a lot for watching, thanks a lot for my supporters, and see you in the next one. Bye bye!